It started like any other training cycle, a group of cadets convinced they knew who belonged and who didn't, but hidden among them was someone carrying a truth too heavy to stay buried. Every insult, every shove, every sneer only pushed the story closer to a moment that would silence the loudest voices and force even the highest ranks to bow in recognition. Don't miss what happens next. And remember to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and which moment struck you hardest. Dorian Hayes, a quiet black recruit, arrived at the NATO training facility before sunrise, the mist still clinging to the gravel as his battered pickup truck rolled to a stop at the far edge of the lot. The vehicle coughed and rattled like it had survived too many winters, standing in sharp contrast to the polished SUVs and spotless sedans of the other cadets. When he stepped out, the difference became even clearer. His boots were cracked and scuffed, the laces frayed, the leather dulled from years of use. His jacket was faded, its color uncertain after too many washes. Over one shoulder, he carried a duffel bag that looked almost as old as he was, its strap held together by stitching he had repaired himself. He didn't swagger or try to force attention, but every head turned anyway. In this world of sharp uniforms and polished pride, he was an anomaly, and anomalies were targets. The mostly white cadets leaned on their cars or stood in small groups, whispering and smirking as though he had wandered into the wrong place. To them, he looked like a janitor, a maintenance worker, maybe even a charity case. He was immediately branded the outsider, and they were eager to remind him of it. Dorian didn't respond. His silence was deliberate, practiced, the kind of silence that carried its own weight. He adjusted the strap of his bag, straightened his back, and walked toward the gate. The NATO training facility was designed to intimidate. Towering metal fences, guard posts bristling with cameras, and the vast yard where cadets would be broken down and remade into soldiers. Pride dripped from every surface, but so did arrogance. Inside, he checked in with Sergeant Vaughn, a gruff officer who didn't even lift his eyes as he spoke. "Name?" he demanded, his pen hovering over the clipboard. "Dorian Hayes," he answered steadily. Vaughn scanned the sheet, then scowled. "Barrack C, don't slow us down." The dismissal was immediate, casual, almost rehearsed. To Vaughn, Dorian had already failed without taking a single step. As he moved past, a blonde cadet named Madison Caldwell called out just loud enough for others to hear. "Guess they're filling quotas now. Must be Diversity Day." The group around her erupted in laughter, harsh and sharp. Dorian kept walking. He had heard versions of this his whole life. He knew what it meant to be dismissed by people who had never even spoken to him. His skin made him suspect, his silence made him weak, and together they believed it gave them permission to strip him of dignity. But he also knew silence could be its own weapon. Inside Barrack C, rows of bunks stretched down the walls. The air smelled of bleach and steel, and cadets were already unpacking, stacking their pristine gear with proud efficiency. Dorian set his duffel down on the bunk assigned to him, his motions quiet but sure. He began unpacking his modest belongings, a few folded shirts, socks, worn running shoes, and a single notebook. The contrast to the others was glaring. Trevor Kincaid, a tall white recruit with close-cropped blonde hair, sneered openly. "What is this, a handout program? Guess we've got charity cases now." The room laughed again. Dorian met his eyes for a single heartbeat, then calmly continued unpacking. He placed each item with care, his hand steady, his expression unreadable. At the bottom of the bag, he tucked away a small, creased photograph, sliding it under his pillow without a word. The mocking voices grew louder, sharper, trying to provoke him. Grant Ellison, the golden boy of the class, stepped up beside him, his grin polished like a weapon. "This isn't a soup kitchen, Hayes. This is where real soldiers train." Dorian finally spoke, his voice low and even. "I'm where I'm supposed to be." The simplicity of his words made them scoff louder, but their laughter didn't change him. He continued folding his shirt, continued preparing his space as though their words had no weight. That calm refusal to rise to their bait frustrated them. Bullies thrived on reaction, and his lack of it would make them double their cruelty in the days to come. Outside, the whistle blew sharp and commanding. Cadets scrambled, pulling on jackets and lacing boots. Dorian tied his frayed laces tighter and stepped outside into the brisk morning air. The training yard was already buzzing. Cadets standing in uneven rows, shoulders squared, faces flushed with adrenaline and arrogance. Dorian walked into place, feeling every stare on him, every smirk, every whispered insult meant to remind him of his place. To them, he was less. To them, he was expendable. But deep beneath the quiet, beneath the worn clothes and humble manner, was something they could not see. The first full day at the NATO training facility was designed to break down spirits and expose weakness, and Dorian Hayes felt the sharp weight of that design as the hours unfolded. From the grueling physical drills that had cadets gasping for air to the endless lectures barked by instructors who seemed to thrive on intimidation, every moment was engineered to test limits. Yet for Dorian, the greatest strain did not come from the drills or the shouting, but from the unrelenting eyes of his fellow cadets who saw him as little more than a target. When evening came and the mess hall opened, the recruits flooded inside with the restless energy of youth. The space was wide and echoing, filled with long metal tables and the clatter of trays, silverware, and boots. It smelled of overcooked meat and powdered potatoes, the kind of food meant to fill the stomach, but never please the senses. Cadets jostled for position in line, laughing, telling stories of imagined glory, each one trying to outshine the other. Dorian entered quietly, keeping his head low, taking the last place in line without complaint. By the time he reached the serving station, the trays were nearly empty, the mashed potatoes congealed, the green beans soggy, the chicken dry. He accepted his portion without a word and carried it toward an empty corner table far from the noise. It was there that Trevor Kincaid spotted him, his pale eyes glittering with cruelty. Trevor had already found his role in the barracks, the loudmouth who gathered attention by tearing someone else down. He had picked Dorian from the very start, and now, in front of a room full of eager eyes, he saw his chance to entertain. With exaggerated swagger, Trevor carried his tray across the room, setting it down across from Dorian's with a loud crash that silenced nearby conversation. "Yo, Hayes," he called, his voice pitched to carry across the entire hall. "You sure you're in the right place? This ain't no soup kitchen." The remark drew laughter from several tables. Dorian kept eating, his fork steady, his eyes fixed on the plate. His silence only fed the hunger of the crowd. Trevor leaned closer, his grin sharp. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're just grateful they let you in here for free?" More laughter followed, harsh and echoing against the metal walls. Dorian looked up briefly, meeting Trevor's eyes with a steady gaze, then lowered his eyes again and took another bite. The calmness of the gesture enraged Trevor. He wanted a reaction. He wanted fear, anger, shame, anything but this unshakable quiet. With a smirk, Trevor reached across the table and flicked his fingers against Dorian's tray. The movement sent a spoonful of mashed potatoes splattering across Dorian's shirt. The room howled with laughter. Phones came out, cadets eager to record the humiliation for later amusement. Some shouted crude jokes, others clapped as though it were a performance. Madison Caldwell, sitting a few tables away, laughed loudest of all, tossing her blonde ponytail as though she had witnessed something truly hilarious. Still, Dorian did not rise. He calmly set down his fork, picked up a napkin, and wiped the potatoes from his shirt with slow, deliberate movements. Then he returned to his meal as if nothing had happened. The deliberate composure unsettled more than one cadet, though none would admit it. Trevor's grin faltered, then tightened again. He leaned closer, his voice a harsh whisper meant only for Dorian. "You think you're better than us? You think silence makes you strong? You're nothing here. Nothing." Dorian did not look at him. He finished his meal bite by bite, every movement slow and controlled. When his tray was empty, he stood, carried it to the return station, and walked out of the hall without a single word. The silence he left behind was louder than any argument. Trevor sat at the table, fuming, his fists clenched, his performance falling flat in the wake of Dorian's refusal to play his game. Madison frowned, disappointed that the spectacle had ended without tears or anger. For the first time, a few cadets exchanged uneasy glances, as though sensing that the man they mocked was not the weakling they imagined. Later that night in the barracks, Trevor and Grant recounted the story with exaggerated detail, embellishing Dorian's silence as cowardice. They mimicked his calm expression, twisting it into something pathetic. Their voices carried across the room, and others laughed again, eager to return to the safety of the familiar narrative that Dorian Hayes was an intruder, a mistake, a man unfit to wear the same uniform as them. But Helena Marquez, a quiet cadet who had watched from the far side of the hall, said nothing. She had seen the steadiness in Dorian's eyes, the deliberate control in his movements. She recognized it for what it was: strength. The others had mistaken silence for weakness, but Helena knew better. Strength did not always shout. Sometimes it sat quietly, enduring, waiting for the right moment. The night grew quiet as lights dimmed, but in whispers and half-laughs, the story of the mess hall humiliation passed from bunk to bunk. Dorian lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind calm despite the cruelty. He had expected this. He had endured worse. The morning after the humiliation in the mess hall began with the sharp blow of the instructor's whistle echoing through the barracks, jerking cadets from their bunks and sending them scrambling to pull on boots and uniforms. But while the others laughed and shouted as they dressed, Dorian Hayes moved with quiet precision, tying his frayed laces and folding his blanket with calm, deliberate hands that ignored the whispers already stirring about him. The memory of Trevor's potatoes smeared across his shirt had not faded from the minds of his peers, and rather than dull their appetite for cruelty, it sharpened it. As they gathered in formation on the training yard, Trevor leaned toward Grant Ellison with a grin stretched wide across his face, whispering loudly enough for others to hear that he wondered if today they would give Dorian a mop instead of a rifle. The laughter that followed was immediate, harsh, and carried easily across the crisp morning air. Madison Caldwell smirked at the edge of the formation, her voice cutting like glass as she added that maybe Dorian should just serve breakfast instead of trying to run drills with them. The officers did not intervene. To them, banter was part of breaking down weakness. But this was not banter. This was targeted cruelty, a ritual designed to strip Dorian of dignity in front of the entire group. The whistle blew again, signaling the start of the morning run, and the cadets surged forward like a pack of eager hounds, their boots pounding the dirt in a steady rhythm. Dorian kept his pace measured, his breathing even, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not chase the leaders, nor did he lag behind. He simply ran in silence, holding his rhythm as if he belonged to another world entirely. That silence irritated Grant, who thrived on dominance and control. He slowed his pace just enough to fall beside Dorian, his broad shoulders brushing deliberately against him before delivering a sharp shove. Dorian stumbled, his boots sinking into the mud, and laughter erupted from the line ahead. Grant grinned, feigning mock concern. "Careful there, Hayes. You might trip over your own shoelaces. Maybe we'll get you a babysitter." The group roared with laughter, their breathless taunts carried back on the wind. Dorian pushed himself upright, wiped his muddy palms against his pants, and resumed his pace without answering. His silence was an insult to them, his refusal to give them the explosion they craved. He knew this only ensured that they would escalate. By the time they returned to the yard, sweat soaking through their shirts, their taunts had become a rhythm of their own. Trevor called him charity case with every push-up, while Madison muttered under her breath about quotas during squats. Even Marcus Webb, who had said little before, joined in, asking loudly if the instructors offered discounts for recruits who couldn't afford real gear. When the run ended and the cadets collapsed onto the benches, gasping for air, Dorian pulled a granola bar from his duffel and sat quietly, his breathing steady, his eyes calm. That composure made Madison bristle with anger. She stalked over, flanked by two others, her arms crossed and her expression painted with smug superiority. "So tell us, Hayes," she said, her voice syrupy with mock concern, "where are you even from? Did you win some kind of contest to be here? Maybe a charity raffle?" Her friends giggled, one covering her mouth as if the absurdity was too much to bear. Dorian took a bite, chewed slowly, and looked up at her with those steady eyes. His answer was simple, flat, and devoid of any theatrics. "I applied." The simplicity of his words silenced them for a moment, but Madison pressed harder, unwilling to let him walk away unscathed. "Okay, but why?" she demanded, her tone sharper now. "You don't exactly scream elite soldier. I mean, look at you. Look at everything about you." She gestured at his worn boots, his plain clothes, the quiet way he carried himself. Dorian set the granola bar down and leaned forward just enough to make Madison flinch, though his voice remained calm and low. "I'm here to train," he said. "Not to make you feel better about yourself." The words landed with a sting sharper than any insult. Madison's face flushed red, her smirk collapsing into a tight line as she muttered something under her breath and turned away. Her friends followed, their laughter forced and brittle now. That afternoon, The cadets were given their first navigation exercise, a trek across a forested ridge with only a compass and a map to guide them under a strict time limit. It was the kind of drill designed to separate the leaders from the followers, the strong from the weak, and it quickly became another opportunity to target Dorian. As he paused beneath an oak tree to check his bearings, Kyle Martinez spotted him, his wiry frame vibrating with restless energy and his ambition to outshine Grant. "Hey, Dora the Explorer," Kyle shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "You lost already? Or just looking for flowers?" His group laughed, circling closer like hyenas. Dorian folded his map with steady hands and continued walking, but Kyle wasn't finished. He jogged forward, snatched the map from Dorian's hands, and with a grin tore it in half before tossing the pieces into the wind. His friends cheered as the scraps fluttered away. The harassment did not stop after the navigation drill. If anything, it thickened like storm clouds gathering over the camp, and though Dorian Hayes had shown nothing but calm resilience, the other cadets saw his silence as weakness and pressed harder, convinced that if they kept piling on enough humiliation, he would eventually crack. But what they could not see, what none of them had the faintest clue about, was that he was carrying knowledge and training far beyond anything they had ever touched, skills buried deep that he had no intention of revealing until circumstance forced his hand. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. The rifle disassembly drill was announced after morning formation, a test designed to measure precision and familiarity with the weapon that was the lifeblood of every soldier. The rules were simple. Disassemble the M4 carbine, clean it thoroughly, and reassemble it to exact military specifications within 2 minutes. For many cadets, this was their first serious encounter with the rifle, and nerves ran high, hands fumbling with pins and bolts under the eyes of instructors who prowled like wolves around the tables. Madison Caldwell went first, her hands shaking as she tried to mimic what she had seen in demonstrations, fumbling pieces, barely finishing within the time limit. Trevor Kincaid followed, cursing under his breath when a spring shot across the table, his sloppy reassembly earning a disappointed grunt from the sergeant. Grant Ellison swaggered to his station with confidence and speed, finishing in 1 minute and 43 seconds, puffing his chest as though he had won a prize. Laughter and applause rippled through the ranks, feeding his ego. Then came Dorian. He stepped forward quietly, his face calm, his movements unhurried. The other cadets snickered, expecting him to fail spectacularly, expecting him to confirm their belief that he did not belong. But as soon as the stopwatch began, his hands moved with a rhythm and control that silenced the laughter in seconds. Pin out, bolt removed, parts laid out in a perfect grid, each motion deliberate and flawless, his fingers never slipping, his breathing steady. The disassembly took mere seconds, his cleaning swift but thorough, his reassembly smoother than anything the instructors had seen that day. When he slammed the final pin into place and set the rifle down, the stopwatch read 52 seconds. 52 seconds without a single mistake, without a single wasted motion. Silence spread across the training yard. Sergeant Polk, a grizzled veteran with decades of service, stared at the timer as if it might be broken, then stared at Dorian, then back at the rifle. His voice was low, thoughtful, almost disbelieving when he asked, "Where'd you learn to do that?" Dorian wiped his hands calmly on his trousers, his eyes lowered. "Practice," he said simply, offering no elaboration, no hint of the truth behind his skill. The other cadets stared, confusion clouding their faces. Grant scoffed loudly, desperate to regain the spotlight. "So he can clean a gun," he sneered, making sure everyone could hear. "Doesn't mean he can fight." Laughter followed again, but it was thinner now, forced, as if the joke no longer carried the same bite. A seed of doubt had been planted in their minds, and though they clung to their arrogance, they could not erase the image of his flawless precision. That afternoon, whispers began circulating among the cadets. Some wondered aloud if he had prior training, others dismissed it as luck, but the instructors exchanged looks that spoke of something else entirely. For men who had seen true soldiers in action, there was no mistaking the discipline in Dorian's hands. During the break that followed, Helena Marquez slipped quietly toward him, her steps cautious, her eyes darting to make sure no one else noticed. She pulled a folded map from her pocket and held it out to him. "You'll need this," she whispered, her voice low, her tone laced with sincerity. Dorian took the map, nodded once, and tucked it into his bag without a word. He did not thank her, but his eyes softened briefly, and she understood. In a world where he had been treated as nothing, her small act of kindness was a light piercing the fog. Around them, the other cadets still laughed and jeered, but the sound no longer filled the space the way it once had. It was thinner, weaker, and though they did not admit it, many of them had begun to watch Dorian differently. They had started to notice the steadiness of his hands, the patience of his eyes, the silence that no longer seemed like weakness but like a wall they could not breach. That evening in the barracks, Trevor tried to retell the story as though Dorian's success had been meaningless, but his voice lacked conviction. Madison scoffed and muttered that it must have been a fluke, but when she met Helena's gaze, she faltered, sensing that not everyone believed the lie anymore. Grant, unwilling to yield his crown, declared loudly that he would crush Dorian in any combat drill, that cleaning a rifle was a parlor trick and nothing more. His bravado was met with laughter, but it was nervous laughter, laughter laced with unease. The whispers from the rifle drill lingered through the night and into the next morning, and though the cadets laughed and jeered as they always had, the sound carried a sharper edge, a forced insistence that masked the unease creeping into their minds. Dorian Hayes had shown something undeniable, something that made even the instructors pause, and for young men and women who had built their identities on being the best, that single moment of skill was a threat they could not ignore. Grant Ellison in particular burned with humiliation, replaying the image of Dorian's calm precision over and over, twisting it into a challenge he had to crush. Madison Caldwell fanned the fire with her barbed whispers, reminding everyone that the so-called outsider had embarrassed them all by outperforming them so effortlessly. Trevor Kincaid, never one to think for himself, joined every laugh and every plot to put Dorian back in his place. The next test was a long-distance run, 10 miles across rough terrain in full gear, a brutal grind meant to expose weakness and break those who lacked endurance. It was exactly the kind of test that offered endless opportunities for sabotage, and the group made sure to take advantage. The run began under the blaze of the morning sun, the heat already pressing down on their backs as they pounded across the rocky trail. Dust rose with each step, sticking to sweat-slick skin, and the weight of the gear dragged at their shoulders. In the front of the pack, Grant surged ahead with practiced arrogance, his long strides eating up the ground, while Madison ran close behind, her ponytail whipping against her back, her eyes glinting with malice whenever they flicked toward Dorian. Dorian stayed in the middle of the formation, his pace steady, his breathing measured, his silence unbroken. He did not chase the leaders, nor did he fall behind. He simply ran, his rhythm calm and controlled, his face unreadable even as the sweat poured down. At the halfway mark, the instructors barked at the cadets to maintain formation, but the order was nothing more than background noise to Madison, who had already decided that this was her chance. She drifted closer, her steps deliberate, waiting for the perfect moment when exhaustion had dulled reflexes and the uneven ground offered no mercy. With a quick shove of her elbow, subtle enough to look accidental, she sent Dorian's foot catching against a jagged rock. His body pitched forward, his ankle twisting painfully as he stumbled off the trail into the dirt. The formation groaned with frustration, as Captain Harrow, watching from the sidelines, roared his judgment across the field. Mitchell broke formation, squad loses points. The entire group turned their fury on Dorian, their glares sharp, their anger loud. Grant spat words between gasps for air, his face flushed with rage. "Nice one, Hayes. Real team player." Dorian did not argue. He pushed himself upright, jaw tight, the pain in his ankle sending a white-hot spike up his leg, but he did not limp. He resumed his pace, rejoining the group, each step deliberate, refusing to show the damage Madison had inflicted. The laughter that followed him was loud, cruel, and laced with satisfaction, but he absorbed it in silence, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The run stretched on, the terrain punishing, the heat relentless. One by one, cadets began to falter, their strides uneven, their shoulders sagging, but Dorian kept moving, his endurance unshaken even with the twisted ankle. His silence, his refusal to yield, gnawed at them more than any insult could. When they finally staggered back into camp, drenched in sweat and gasping for air, Captain Harrow pointed directly at Dorian. 5 extra laps, move. The order hit the group like a hammer. Some smirked, others sighed in relief that they had not been chosen, but none offered a word of protest. Dorian nodded once and began to run again, his body aching, his ankle throbbing, his lungs burning, but his stride never faltered. The others gathered water and collapsed onto the benches, watching as he circled the field again and again, his back straight, his face calm, his silence unbroken. By the time he finished the last lap, his shirt was soaked through, his chest heaving with short gasps, his legs trembling with exhaustion, but he did not collapse. He walked to the water station, took a slow sip, and stood quietly, his eyes scanning the ground. Madison smirked and tossed an empty bottle at his feet, her voice dripping with cruelty. "Hydrate with air," she sneered, laughing at her own joke. The group chuckled weakly, but even their laughter had lost some of its edge. Dorian bent, picked up the bottle, crushed it slowly in his hand, and dropped it into the trash without a word. That night in the barracks, the story of his extra laps spread quickly, twisted by Trevor and Madison into another tale of incompetence. They mocked his stumble, his punishment, painting him as dead weight dragging them all down. The others laughed, eager to believe, eager to restore their illusion of superiority. But Helena Marquez, listening quietly from her bunk, saw the truth. She had watched him run those extra laps with an endurance that none of them could have matched. She had seen the pain in his ankle, the sweat soaking his shirt, and the way he never once complained. To her, it was not weakness. It was strength, a kind of strength that terrified the others because it was not built on arrogance or showmanship, but on silence, control, and an unbreakable will. The punishment of extra laps had left Dorian Hayes sore and battered, yet when the dawn whistle jolted the barracks awake, he rose with the same calm precision as always, his movements steady, his face expressionless. The cadets who had watched him endure 10 miles with a twisted ankle followed by 5 grueling laps had gone to bed convinced he would break overnight, that he would limp into formation or collapse during drills, but instead he appeared in the yard with his boots laced tight, his shoulders straight, his eyes steady, and that very composure irritated them more than anything else. Grant Ellison muttered under his breath that Dorian must have been too stupid to feel pain, while Madison Caldwell whispered that maybe he had simply gotten lucky with endurance and would fail the next test. Their confidence returned when the instructors announced the long-range shooting examination, 5 shots at 400 meters, 5 bullseyes required for a passing mark. The pressure was brutal, the silence at the range absolute as cadets prepared their rifles, adjusted their scopes, and whispered nervously about wind speed. Madison went first, her hands shaking as she pulled the trigger, 2 of her shots missing the target entirely. Her face paled, her lips pressed tight, but she forced a smile as she stepped aside. Grant hit 4 out of 5, his jaw clenching when the last bullet veered just shy of the bullseye. He cursed under his breath, his golden boy image dented but not destroyed. Then Dorian was called forward. The cadets snickered, eager to see him humiliate himself, but Helena Marquez watched quietly, her eyes sharp, sensing that something was about to change. Dorian walked to the rifle, checked it once, and lowered himself into position with a calmness that silenced the murmurs around him. He did not fidget with the scope, did not take practice swings, did not mutter calculations under his breath. He simply aimed, breathed, and pulled the trigger. The first shot cracked through the air, hitting the center of the target dead on. Then the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth followed, each one as precise as the last. 5 shots, 5 bullseyes, all executed with mechanical precision, his movements so controlled that it seemed less like shooting and more like a rehearsed dance. The range officer stared at the target display, blinked, and then looked back at Dorian as if his eyes were betraying him. His voice carried across the range, sharp and clear. "Mitchell, perfect score." The yard went silent. The silence did not last long. Grant barked out a laugh that was too loud, too forced. "Lucky shots," he declared, shaking his head. "Even a broken clock is right sometimes." His words sounded hollow, but the cadets clung to them, desperate to restore the fragile balance of their world. Yet the instructors saw what the cadets refused to admit. They had noticed the rifle's scope, misaligned just enough to throw any ordinary shooter off target. They knew that what Dorian had done was not luck but mastery, a skill honed by countless hours of training and experience that no ordinary recruit could ever possess. Sergeant Polk muttered to another instructor that Dorian's hands had never shaken once, that his trigger control was the mark of someone far beyond civilian training. Still, Dorian offered no explanation. He stood, set the rifle down, and returned to his place in formation with the same silence as always, his expression unreadable. That evening in the mess hall, the cadets tried once again to provoke him, unwilling to let the memory of his flawless shooting settle in their minds. Jenna Walsh, tall and smug, approached his corner table with a half-eaten apple in hand. She dropped it onto his tray with exaggerated pity, her voice dripping with mockery. "Can't have you starving, right? You need your strength for something, maybe carrying our bags." The table behind her burst into laughter. Phones lifted to record what they thought would be another humiliation. Dorian looked at the apple, then at Jenna, his gaze steady and unflinching. He picked it up, took a slow, deliberate bite, and chewed in silence. The laughter faltered, uncertain now, because they had expected tears or anger, but instead they were confronted with something that felt more unsettling than either. He ate the entire apple, core and all, then set the tray aside and stood to leave. As he passed Jenna, his shoulder brushed hers just enough to make her stumble back, her confidence cracking under the weight of his unshaken calm. The mess hall fell silent, every eye fixed on the quiet black recruit who had just dismantled their ridicule without saying a word. Later, in the barracks, the story twisted through whispers again, but this time it carried a different tone. Trevor tried to frame it as cowardice, claiming that Dorian was too dull to realize he was being mocked, but the lie sounded hollow even to those eager to believe it. Helena, lying on her bunk with her notebook in hand, thought of the way he had eaten that apple, how his silence had felt less like submission and more like defiance, a silent statement louder than any words. She understood what the others could not admit. Strength did not always need to shout. Sometimes strength looked like calm control in the face of cruelty. The silence that followed the apple incident in the mess hall did not fade as quickly as the cadets wanted, and though they tried to laugh louder and mock harder, the edge of unease in their voices betrayed that something fundamental had shifted. Yet Grant Ellison refused to accept that shift, his pride raw from being overshadowed not once but twice by the man he had branded as weak, and when the instructors announced the next test, hand-to-hand combat drills designed to pit cadets against one another in front of the entire squad, he immediately sought out Dorian Hayes as his opponent, eager to crush him publicly and erase the humiliation of the shooting range. The training yard was cleared for the matches, mats laid out under the blazing sun, instructors lining the perimeter with clipboards and sharp eyes. Cadets gathered around with phones hidden in pockets ready to record any moment that might bring more ridicule to the quiet black recruit. Names were called, pairs took their places, fists collided, bodies slammed, but when Dorian's name was shouted and paired with Grant's, a murmur rippled through the crowd, the anticipation of spectacle heavy in the air. Grant towered over Dorian, his 6-foot frame bulging with muscle, his confidence radiating like a beacon. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his knuckles, and grinned like a predator closing in on easy prey, while Dorian stood calm, his shoulders relaxed, his eyes steady, his silence more unsettling than words could ever be. The whistle blew, and Grant lunged immediately, grabbing Dorian by the collar with both hands and slamming him hard against the padded wall. The impact rattled the room, a collective gasp rising from the cadets as Dorian's shirt tore open across the back. Madison Caldwell shrieked with laughter, her phone raised high to capture the supposed humiliation. "Look at that," she jeered, her voice sharp. "He's got tattoos too. What is this, some kind of gang mark?" The others roared with laughter, convinced that this was the moment the outsider would finally be broken. But then, the laughter faltered. The torn fabric slid lower across Dorian's shoulder blade, and etched across his skin in stark black ink was a tattoo unlike anything they had ever seen. A coiled viper wrapped around a shattered human skull, its fangs dripping venom, its eyes hollow voids that seemed to swallow the very sunlight. The yard went silent, the cruel grins evaporating in an instant, the sound of the wind louder than the stunned breaths of the cadets. Even Grant, his fist still gripping Dorian's torn shirt, froze in place, his predatory grin fading as he stared at the mark. Madison's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the concrete, forgotten. Trevor muttered a curse under his breath, his face pale, his confidence gone. The instructors exchanged sharp glances, their rigid discipline cracking as recognition spread through them. And then Colonel Warren Keating, who had been observing from across the yard, stepped forward with movements stiff and deliberate, his weathered face drained of color, his eyes wide with disbelief. His voice shook with something between fear and reverence when he demanded, "Who gave you the right to wear that mark?" The cadets exchanged panicked glances, suddenly realizing that the symbol was not a meaningless tattoo, but something far more dangerous. Dorian stood tall, his back straight despite Grant's grip, his voice low but clear enough to carry across the silent yard. "I didn't ask for it," he said. "It was given to me by Ghost Viper himself. I trained under him for 6 years." The words hit the yard like a physical blow, the name Ghost Viper slicing through the air with the weight of legend. Colonel Keating's hand rose in a perfect salute, his voice filled with awe. "No one bears that tattoo unless they are his final student, his only student." The cadets stared, their faces pale, their arrogance crumbling. Ghost Viper was a name whispered in military folklore, a shadow of a man who had trained operatives so lethal they were erased from official records, a myth said to have died with his entire unit years ago. To see his mark inked on Dorian's back was to see proof that the legend lived on, and that the quiet black recruit they had mocked was something beyond their comprehension. Grant's hand slackened, his body trembling with disbelief. "This is bullshit," he snarled, his voice rising with desperate anger, trying to cling to the last scraps of his pride. "I don't care what tattoo you've got or what story you tell. Prove it in a real fight." Colonel Keating barked a warning, his voice sharp with authority, but Grant ignored him, shoving Dorian forward and raising his fists. Dorian looked at him for a long moment, the careful blankness of his face slipping just enough to reveal something colder, sharper, more calculating. "If that's what you want," he said softly. Grant charged, fists swinging in a flurry of wild haymakers, his rage blinding him to everything but the need to strike. But Dorian moved like water, his footwork so subtle it seemed he was barely shifting at all, his body gliding just out of reach of every punch. Grant's swings grew sloppier, his breath ragged, his frustration boiling over as his attacks landed on nothing but air. "Hit me already!" he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. Dorian remained silent, his eyes fixed, studying, waiting. And then the moment came. Grant overextended on a wild right hook, his balance broken for a split second, and in that heartbeat Dorian stepped inside his guard, his arms sliding around his neck with fluid precision. For a moment, they looked like dancers locked in embrace, and then Grant's body went slack, his eyes rolling back as Dorian executed a sleeper hold so clean and efficient that most of the cadets barely understood what they had seen. 8 seconds later, Grant Ellison, the golden boy of the camp, the bully who had led every taunt and every humiliation, collapsed unconscious at Dorian's feet. The shock of the tattoo revelation still hung in the air long after Dorian Hayes walked back to the barracks with his torn shirt barely covering the ink that had shattered their perception of him, and though the cadets tried to compose themselves, whispering excuses or clinging to disbelief, the silence of Colonel Keating's salute and the weight of the name Ghost Viper pressed down on them with a gravity they could not shake. That night the barracks was not filled with the usual noise of laughter and insults, but with hushed speculation, fragments of myth pieced together by young recruits who had grown up hearing rumors of operatives who never missed, of missions that never existed, of a phantom trainer who forged soldiers into weapons that vanished from records and history alike. Dorian lay quietly on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, his breathing steady, while Grant Ellison's bunk remained empty, his body still recovering in the infirmary from the precision sleeper hold that had ended his reign of arrogance in front of everyone. Madison Caldwell scrolled through her phone in silence, her fingers trembling as she looked at the half-recorded video of Dorian's tattoo, uncertain whether to delete it or use it as leverage, her instincts torn between fear and ambition. Trevor Kincaid muttered weakly that it was all exaggerated, that maybe the tattoo meant nothing, but even he sounded unconvinced. And when Helena Marquez whispered from across the room that she believed every word Dorian had said, no one argued. The following morning, the instructors assembled the cadets in formation, their expressions unusually tense, their voices clipped. Captain Harrow stood in front of them with Colonel Keating at his side, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp. "Effective immediately," he repeated for emphasis. "Cadet Hayes is not to be treated as your equal. He is your instructor, and you will show him the respect he has earned." The words rippled through the formation like a current, cadets stiffening at the official confirmation of what they had already witnessed. Grant was not present, his pride and his body still broken, and his absence made the truth even more glaring. Dorian stood silently at the side of the formation, his face unreadable, his stance calm, but the weight of every eye on him was undeniable. He had not asked for authority, had not demanded recognition, yet now it had been thrust upon him, and the very cadets who had mocked his clothes, his boots, and his silence were being ordered to follow his lead. The first test of this new dynamic came quickly in the form of a combat simulation exercise, an urban assault scenario that required squads to clear buildings, neutralize targets, and maintain communication under pressure. Dorian was placed in charge of one team, and to the displeasure of almost everyone, Madison was assigned under his command. She rolled her eyes dramatically, muttered something under her breath about charity cases leading drills, but did not dare speak louder. The exercise began, the squad moving through the mock city with rifles raised and nerves taut. Dorian signaled silently, his hand gestures crisp and deliberate, his movements smooth and economical. He directed them with the same quiet efficiency he had shown in every challenge, and Helena followed without hesitation, her trust in him absolute. Madison, however, bristled at the idea of following his orders, her pride unable to bend. She ignored a hand signal, rushing ahead into an alley where a tripwire snapped, setting off a deafening alarm that froze the entire squad in place. The exercise ground to a halt, instructors storming in with fury on their faces. Captain Harrow's voice thundered across the yard. "Mitchell, your team's a disaster." Madison smirked faintly, whispering to Trevor that this proved what she had said all along, that Dorian might have a fancy tattoo but no leadership skills. The squad muttered agreement, relieved to return to their familiar pattern of blaming him. Dorian stood calmly, his eyes level, and spoke without hesitation. Madison broke formation. I signaled her to wait. She ignored the signal. His words were delivered not in anger but with absolute clarity, and Captain Harrow turned his gaze on Madison, who shrugged innocently, her voice syrupy with false sincerity. "I didn't see any signal." Laughter rippled through the squad, the mockery of old returning with renewed strength. For a moment it seemed as though the tide would turn back against Dorian, but then an instructor called for the drone footage, the recording that monitored every training drill from overhead. The replay left no room for argument. The screen showed Dorian signaling clearly, Madison turning her head deliberately away and then charging forward in direct defiance. The evidence was undeniable. Captain Harrow's jaw clenched tighter with every passing second of the footage. When it ended, he turned back to Madison, his face a mask of controlled fury. 50 points docked from your squad, he declared. And latrine duty for a week. The squad went silent, their laughter dying instantly, their faces pale. Madison's smirk vanished, replaced by shock and humiliation. For the first time, the pattern had broken. The lie had not held, the scapegoat had not worked, and the truth had exposed her for all to see. Dorian said nothing, simply returned to his position, his silence heavier now than ever before. That evening, the barracks felt different. The cadets avoided his eyes, their whispers subdued, their mockery weaker. Even Trevor, always eager to parrot Grant's arrogance, kept his voice down. Madison sulked in her bunk, her humiliation gnawing at her, her eyes burning with hatred whenever they flicked toward Dorian. But Helena watched him with open respect now, her conviction stronger than ever. She knew what the others still resisted admitting, that Dorian's authority was not a trick of circumstance or a fluke of luck, but the natural weight of who he was, a man forged by training they could not comprehend, carrying a mark that no one could fake. Over the next 2 days, Captain Harrow himself changed. The instructor who had once dismissed Dorian as supply crew began to watch him carefully, his sharp commands softening into requests when directed toward him. During briefings, he paused to ask Dorian's opinion, something he had never done with any other cadet in 20 years of service. It was not just respect, it was recognition. Recognition that he was standing in the presence of someone whose experience and training far exceeded his own. The other cadets noticed this shift, and it unsettled them more than any lecture could. They began to realize that the mockery had ended not because Dorian had fought back with words, but because the truth had crushed their illusions beyond repair. The transformation of the camp was undeniable after the combat simulation where Madison's sabotage was exposed, and while cadets tried to adjust to the reality of Dorian Hayes' authority, whispers still filled the air about what the tattoo truly meant and what kind of life he had lived before stepping onto the yard in worn boots and a torn jacket. And those whispers only grew louder when Colonel Keating ordered an unscheduled assembly 2 days later, his face more pale and severe than usual, his tone carrying a weight that suggested something monumental was about to happen. The cadets gathered in tight formation near the main gate, their nervous chatter silenced by the sight of a convoy pulling up the gravel drive. Dust billowing behind black vehicles that were not marked with any official insignia, but radiated the unmistakable aura of authority. Soldiers snapped to attention as a tall man stepped out from the lead car, his presence commanding the space instantly. He wore civilian clothes, a black tactical jacket, pressed dark jeans, and boots polished to a muted shine, but everything about him screamed military. His short hair was silvered at the temples, his posture straight as steel, his every movement precise with the rhythm of a man who had lived a lifetime in combat zones. The guards at the gate stepped back with nervous respect, and even Colonel Keating straightened further, his hands clasped tight behind his back. When Dorian appeared at the edge of the formation, the man's eyes locked on him immediately, recognition flickering in the gaze of someone who had not seen him in years yet knew him at once. For the first time since his arrival, Dorian's expression shifted, the stoic calm cracking just enough to reveal something raw beneath something like relief, or memory, or even longing. He stepped forward slowly, the crowd parting without a word, and the man in the jacket waited for him at the center of the yard, his hands steady, his presence radiating the weight of decades of command. Colonel Keating's voice carried across the silent formation. "Cadets, this is General Thomas Reed." Gasps rippled through the ranks. The name was known to every recruit, a living legend in military circles, a man whispered about in connection with operations so secret they were denied on record, a commander whose decisions had altered the course of wars. To see him here in person was like watching a myth step into daylight. The cadets expected a formal address, perhaps words of authority to reinforce discipline, but instead, the general's focus remained fixed on Dorian. The two men stood only a few feet apart, and what passed between them in silence was louder than any speech. Finally, Dorian spoke, his voice softer than any had heard it since he had first set foot in the camp. "You didn't have to come." General Reed tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in the barest suggestion of a smile. "Yes," he said. "I did." The simplicity of the exchange struck the cadets like thunder. Madison's jaw went slack, Trevor's eyes widened, Helena covered her mouth in shock. The entire yard seemed frozen in that moment, and then Colonel Keating's voice rang out again, deliberate and formal. "Cadets, this is General Reed, Olivia Hayes's husband." The revelation was seismic, the weight of it collapsing years of assumptions in a heartbeat. The man standing before them was not only a decorated general but bound to Dorian in the closest way possible, a tie that explained his aura, his authority, his mystery. Phones slipped from nerveless fingers, cadets staggered back as though struck. The sneers and laughter that had once greeted Dorian's arrival seemed not just cruel now but blasphemous, insults hurled at a figure tied directly to power they could not begin to comprehend. General Reed stepped closer, placing a steady hand on Dorian's shoulder, the same shoulder that bore the mark of Ghost Viper, and in that gesture alone the hierarchy of the yard was rewritten forever. Without further explanation, the two turned together toward the battered pickup truck Dorian had arrived in, the same vehicle mocked by every cadet as a symbol of poverty and weakness. When the engine roared to life, louder and stronger than any of them remembered, the dust that rose behind it seemed to erase the very memory of how they had once seen him. The fallout began immediately. Grant Ellison, still recovering in the infirmary, was summoned before a military review board within days. His attack on Dorian, now known to be a classified operative, was judged conduct unbecoming, and he was discharged with dishonor, his dreams of glory torn away with a permanent stain on his record. His name, once lauded, became a cautionary tale about arrogance and blindness. Madison's fate unraveled even faster. The videos her friends had posted of her mocking Dorian, once sources of entertainment, were now being shared with outrage across social platforms, her laughter replayed against the revelation of who he really was. The defense contractor that had sponsored her training pulled its support overnight, citing values incompatible with cruelty and discrimination. Her social media collapsed under the weight of backlash, followers turning to critics, admiration replaced by disgust. She deleted her accounts, but screenshots lived on, ensuring her humiliation endured. Trevor, always Grant's shadow, found himself relegated to the worst duties on base. his every complaint met with curt reminders that his record of behavior was now permanent. Even Captain Harrow faced consequences. Summoned to a quiet meeting with senior leadership, he was reminded that dismissing recruits based on appearance was not only unprofessional but dangerous. Mandatory retraining followed, and though he returned to the yard, his tone was no longer one of dismissive superiority but of measured respect, especially toward Dorian. For the cadets who remained, the cultural shift was absolute. No longer would harassment be tolerated as ritual initiation. The story of Dorian Hayes became required reading, a lesson in the dangers of judgment, a reminder that the most unassuming figure might be the most formidable. Helena's small act of kindness toward him did not go unnoticed. She was recommended for advanced training and mentorships that elevated her standing within the program. She carried the lesson of humility and respect forward, determined to build a career on the wisdom she had glimpsed in him. The dust from General Reed's convoy had barely settled when the camp began to transform into something unrecognizable from what it had been just weeks earlier. And though Dorian Hayes and the general had driven away in the battered pickup truck that once drew sneers, the echo of their presence lingered in every corridor, every training field, every whispered conversation among cadets who could no longer laugh the way they once had, because the truth had burned the arrogance out of them and replaced it with reverence, fear, and a quiet kind of respect that none dared put into words. The consequences of their cruelty unfolded with brutal clarity. Grant Ellison's discharge was finalized with a dishonorable mark that turned his family name into a cautionary tale. Madison Caldwell's sponsors cut ties, and her public humiliation spread across the internet until she vanished from social media entirely. Trevor Kincaid became a ghost in his own barracks, relegated to cleaning duties under the merciless sun. And even Captain Harrow, once the embodiment of harsh authority, now walked the grounds with caution in his voice and humility in his gaze, his authority reshaped by the knowledge that he had once dismissed a legend as a maintenance worker. The cadets left behind could not escape the shadow of Dorian's mark, the coiled viper etched into their memory as surely as it had been etched into his skin, and though they tried to resume training, every drill felt different, every test weighed heavier, because the example he left behind had stripped away the illusion that strength could be measured by appearance or arrogance. Weeks passed, and his story became official curriculum. New recruits forced to read reports of the incident and answer questions about humility, respect, and the danger of assumptions, and though many rolled their eyes, they quickly learned that the tale of Dorian Hayes was not a cautionary myth, but a truth carved into the very walls of the facility, a truth enforced with harsh penalties for those who dared repeat the cruelties of the past. Helena Marquez thrived in this new culture, her early kindness recognized by mentors who pushed her into advanced programs, and she carried with her the lesson that compassion could be as revolutionary as defiance. She often visited younger cadets, sitting with them at meals, reminding them through small actions that isolation was not weakness, but sometimes the greatest disguise of strength. Madison, long gone, lived on only in whispers as the example of everything not to be, her name spoken with disdain, her downfall a living warning. Grant's name became a bitter footnote in training manuals, a reminder of arrogance punished by reality. Even Trevor's presence faded, his spirit broken by endless humiliations that mirrored the cruelty he had once cheered. But the legend of Dorian did not end at the camp. Stories began to surface quietly, passed between soldiers on bases far from home, tales of a man who appeared in combat zones like a shadow, correcting errors in drills, whispering advice to officers, vanishing before they could thank him. Some swore they saw him on training grounds in Europe, others claimed he was in deserts overseas, and though none of the reports were confirmed, the rumors carried the weight of truth because every soldier who heard them knew in their gut that he was out there, still watching, still serving, still carrying the mark of Ghost Viper into places where few could follow. The internet gave him another name, one not chosen but born of awe: Quiet Strength. Hashtags spread, forums debated his reality, and though official channels denied his existence, the public clung to the idea that the most dangerous person in the room might be the one everyone dismissed. Back at the camp, physical reminders of his presence became unofficial monuments. The corner table in the mess hall where he once sat alone became a place cadets avoided out of reverence. The patch of ground where Grant fell unconscious was marked with whispers of warning. And the spot where Colonel Keating had saluted Dorian became a pilgrimage point for recruits seeking inspiration. Helena often spoke of him to the next generation, not as a figure of legend, but as a man who taught her that silence could be louder than words, that dignity under cruelty could be the sharpest weapon, and that humility was not weakness, but armor stronger than steel. She told them he had never asked for respect, had never sought recognition, and that was why the respect he earned could not be destroyed. Months later, in a secure facility far from the camp, an encrypted phone rang, and the woman who answered looked remarkably like the quiet black recruit who had once endured humiliation in muddy boots, though her eyes were sharper, colder, more certain. The voice on the line uttered a phrase, "Code Phoenix." She felt the past claw its way back to the surface, the ghost of Ghost Viper rising once again, and though she had tried to bury that chapter, she knew the world still needed her strength. General Reed stood by her side, his hand steady on her shoulder, his voice low and certain. "The past never stays buried," he said. She nodded, preparing herself to vanish once again into the shadows where her silence was deadlier than any weapon. The cadets who had once mocked her would graduate, take posts across the world, and carry with them the memory of the day their arrogance crumbled before a man they had thought beneath them. Some would tell the story to their own soldiers, others to their children, each version reshaping the lesson but never erasing its heart, that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one no one notices, and that true strength does not need to announce itself with cruelty or pride. In that way, Dorian Hayes became more than a man. He became a mirror held up to every soldier who believed themselves untouchable, a reminder that humility is as much a weapon as skill, and that respect is not granted by rank or privilege, but by the undeniable truth of who a person is when the world turns against them. The end. If this story kept you hooked until the end, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss the next one. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how the plot unfolded, what part surprised you most, and which moment felt the most powerful. Also, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because your perspective adds so much to these stories.